Hello, everybody. Gene, say hi. Nothing? Rude. I hope you'll be nicer next time. Sheesh. Ignoring everybody. Anyway, hello. Welcome to Writer's Workshop. Today we're doing a little bit of some technical work up there using quotation marks on Google Docs. Okay, we've worked with quotation marks before, but there are some particular formatting rules that allow us, when we're typing out our quotation marks, to make our writing look even clearer and make our dialogue flow even better. Okay, so there's the I can show when a character is speaking by using quotation marks. There's the materials you're going to need today, the exit ticket posted to Google Classroom, and a device with a keyboard. You will also need, I didn't put it in here, so let me put it in there right now. You will need, as soon as you're done with that, your fantasy fiction rough draft, which I'm going to return to you and open up as soon as this video is over. So we're really thinking about keeping our dialogue clear. And that's the point of punctuation, is to make our writing look and feel more clear so it's easier to read for our reader. And quotation marks can be one of the most effective ways to do that because it gives you like a clear start and end to when a character is speaking and when they are not. I'm going to jump right in to this document. So this is part of my rough draft with my two characters, Carlos and Nix. They're investigating, well, we don't know what they're investigating yet, but they are starting to investigate something. And this is a section that has a mix of dialogue and description, so I wanted to highlight that. So first rule up here is quotes go before and after a character is speaking. Okay, and so if I start reading, it says, "Are you sure this is safe, Carlos?" Nix muttered nervously. So in that sentence, we have the quote, we have the thing that Nix is saying, and we have what's called the speech tag. A speech tag is the part of that sentence with dialogue that shows who's speaking and how they're speaking. So, "Are you sure this is safe, Carlos?" is the part that Nix is saying. And then Nix muttered nervously. That's our speech tag because that's describing who's saying it, Nix, and how they're saying it. They're muttering it nervously. So they're not going, "Are you sure this is safe, Carlos?" She's going, "Are you sure this is safe, Carlos?" Right? Difference. So quotation marks are going to go before and after, before the start of the spoken part, the quote, and after the end. So the way to do a quotation mark is you hold down the Shift key, and then our quotation mark button is going to be the one right next to the Enter key. You should see the quotation marks on top and the apostrophe on the bottom. If you don't hold down the Shift key, you get an apostrophe or a single quote. We won't get into single quotes yet. If you hold down both, you get the double quote. And there we go. Make sure my font's the right size. "Are you sure this is safe, Carlos?" Nix muttered nervously. So after Carlos, because that's the last thing Nix is saying, I'm going to end my quote. Okay, so there's step one. Step two, use a comma in between the quote and the speech tag. Now, this first sentence isn't the greatest example because Nix is asking a question. If this wasn't a question, we would have a comma here. But because we have a question, we can put our question mark here, and it's the same thing. It serves the same purpose as our comma to separate the quote from the speech tag. Let's go to the next sentence, and I bet we will use a comma here. It said, "No, Nix, I am not," said Carlos. So, quote before and after. So the "said Carlos" is our speech tag. So we say, "No, Nix, I am not." Aha, and look, Google Docs is already telling us what to do. It read it for us and it went, "Oh, I bet you need a comma and a quotation mark here." So I'm going to put my end quote, and then I'm going to use a comma to separate the quote from the speech tag, and the comma goes inside the quotation mark. And your comma is the button right next to the letter M. It's got a little side caret above it. You don't need the shift key for your comma, okay? You do need the shift key for your quotation marks. Said Carlos. So we're off to a good start. Are you sure this is safe, Carlos? Nix muttered nervously. No, Nix, I am not, said Carlos. And I might even want to put a comma here too. No, Nix, I am not, because he feels like we need a pause there. Let's look at actually, we're going to skip down to rule 4 because we haven't had to use rule 3 yet. Rule 4 says, hit enter, then tab to start a new paragraph when a different character starts speaking. Another way of making your writing look even clearer is when a new character speaks, we're actually going to separate it. So right after Nick's muttering nervously, we're going to hit enter, and then we're going to hit tab to indent our paragraph to show the start of a new paragraph. No, Nix, I am not, said Carlos. Now let's read and let's see when we need another quote. The dark alleyway was lit only by a flickering neon billboard for Blast-Off soda, the gigantic neon bottles bathing the path in intermittent orange and yellow light. A haze of fog obscured the way ahead, but Nix and Carlos noticed the stench almost immediately. So there, did we get any dialogue? No, that was all description. Okay, so we don't need quotation marks there. And then we get to, oh, what is that smell? Nix cried. So, rule number 4, we need to hit enter and then tab to start a new paragraph. Rule number 1, beginning and end of our quote, separating the quote from the speech tag. Because it's a question, we don't need to put a comma here because we have some punctuation there, okay? Ugh, what is that smell? Nix cried. Best case scenario, Carlos replied, wet garbage. What's the worst case scenario? I really, really don't want to think about the worst case scenario. And this is where rule 4 comes in handy, because you notice the last 2 sentences don't have speech tags. We'll get to that, okay? So, best case scenario, Carlos replied. So Carlos is now talking. So as soon as Carlos starts talking, we need a new paragraph. And it's already indented it for us because it knows what we're doing here. Best case scenario, Carlos replied, wet garbage. Now, here's where rule number 3 comes in. Capitalize the first word of the quote. There are exceptions to this rule. Okay? So, whenever you start a quote, beginning or end, you're going to capitalize the first letter of the quote. Okay? So, because it's its own sentence, kind of does look like that. Although, if we're thinking about Carlos saying both best case scenario and wet garbage, okay, we actually don't want a period here. We're going to put a comma here, again, to separate the speech tag from the quote. Best case scenario, Carlos replied, wet garbage. Okay, and I want to show you an exception to the rule. If, let's say the Carlos replied came in the middle of a sentence, and there were like the first half of the sentence before the Carlos replied, the second half of the sentence after the Carlos replied, you wouldn't capitalize the second part. A little confusing the way I said it. So for instance, let's say Carlos was going to reply with, rather than best case scenario, wet garbage, let's put it all in one sentence. What if Carlos replied, the best case scenario would be wet garbage. Okay, that's one sentence all by itself. Okay, but maybe, just to break it up, we want to put our Carlos replied in the middle. So now it says, the best case scenario, Carlos replied, would be wet garbage. Okay, and we need a comma to separate our quote from our speech tag, and we need a comma to separate our speech tag from our quote. Okay, so in this case, we wouldn't capitalize this W in would because it's in the middle of a sentence. Okay, but for the most part, and this can be your general rule, always capitalize the first word inside a quote. Okay, and when you need to not capitalize it, then we'll catch it. Okay, so the rule is going to be capitalize the first letter inside the quote, and then if you have a situation like this, in that case, we would edit it back to a lowercase. Okay, versus the other way around of keeping them all lowercase and then capitalizing every one, that takes a little bit longer and it's a little more editing to do. Okay, most often we're going to capitalize the first word inside a quote. Okay, so I'm going to put it back, and I'm going to use the undo key because it's easier. Okay, Control, hold down Control, and hit Z. And you can undo everything you just did. Okay, also helpful, some of you have been like saying, oh, I accidentally deleted this problem on the math exit ticket. Use Control Z to undo, and whatever you just accidentally deleted will pop back up again. Okay, so best case scenario, Carlos replied, wet garbage. What's the worst case scenario? Now, because Carlos and Nix are the only two characters in this particular section, what inference can we make about who's asking what's the worst case scenario? All right, we can safely assume that that's Nix. So even though there's not a speech tag, we'll hit enter. Whoops. What happened here? We'll hit enter, and then it tabs it over for us. What's the worst case scenario? And then hit enter again, because now we're in the flow of dialogue. Okay? Because what can happen when there's only a couple characters in a scene is, as readers, we can understand that there's like a back and forth between those two characters. The die, like bicycle, die is also a prefix for two. So dialogue really means a conversation between two people. And we can understand that it's going to go Nix, Carlos, Nix, Carlos. So we don't have to put speech tags for every single one once we've established that pattern. Okay, so we could say, what's the worst case scenario? Nix asked. I really, really don't want to think about the worst case scenario, Carlos replied. We could do that, but the like quote, speech tag, quote, speech tag, quote, speech tag can get a little bit tiresome, particularly if we already know who's speaking, right? So if I write it like this, even without these speech tags, ugh, what's that smell? Nix cried. Best case scenario? Carlos replied. Wet garbage. What's the worst case scenario? I really, really don't want to think about the worst case scenario, right? As readers, we already understand and we're already imagining, oh, well, Nix asked what the worst case scenario is and Carlos answered, okay? Once we know the pattern of who's speaking, we don't necessarily have to put a speech tag for everything. Okay? Speech tags for every sentence are certainly more clear. Okay? So when in doubt, add a speech tag of who's speaking and how they're speaking. But eventually we can get into this pattern of being able to show sort of the back and forth. And if we're putting hitting enter and hitting tab, although my Google Docs is smart and it'll figure out how you're trying to format it, and sometimes it'll tab it for you like it's been doing. If you're using enter and tab, we can clearly see, oh, new paragraph, new line, that means there's a new character speaking. And it must be Nix because there's no one else in the scene. And if it was a new person that was being introduced to the scene, there would be a speech tag to let us know. Okay? Let's see, questions in the chat. So we start a new paragraph every time someone else talks, and whenever we start a paragraph, we add an indent. Correct on both. Okay? Again, there are exceptions to this, but they won't happen very often, so that's a good rule to follow. And once you get comfortable with that rule as a writer, then you can figure out when to break that rule or bend that rule. Okay? So here is our, for now, in case we might change some things still. I'm not, not married completely to every word in this section. But this is what our dialogue is going to look like. Okay? So you're going to have 2 steps for this exit ticket. Step 1, well, for your next steps to do after this. Step 1 is to do the exit ticket on Google Classroom. Okay? As soon as you've done that, I will have returned your rough drafts to you, and then you're going through your rough draft and rereading it and adding these quotation marks rules. And I'll remind of our quotation marks rules. They are: step 1, quotes go before and after a character is speaking. 2, use a comma in between the quote and the speech tag. And you'll notice our commas, when they're inside, when they're at the end of a quote, they go inside the quotation mark, okay, before the quotation mark, just like this question mark goes inside the quotation mark, okay? And then our period as well at the end of the sentence goes inside the quotation mark. Capitalize the first word of the quote. There are exceptions, but in general, capitalize the first word of the quote, and then hit Enter, then Tab to start a new paragraph, a new indented paragraph when a different character starts speaking. Okay? Good luck on the exit ticket, and then you're taking your rough draft and you're applying these formatting rules to your rough draft. Yes, you are adding and editing the stories you've already written. Don't write anything new today until you've added quotation marks to the stuff you already wrote. All right, everybody? Thank you so much for tuning in. Writing groups A and B, we will see you at 1 o'clock. Both writing groups A and B, because we didn't have school yesterday. So writing groups A and B, we will see you in the Zoom room at 1 o'clock. Have fun in Makerspace, and then we will see you for Author's Chair at 2:15. All right. Good luck.